All right, welcome to Lecture 2 in Unit 3. This is going to be a lecture about the origins of the Cold War. So it's going to take us from February of 1945 until 1949, 1950 actually, with NSC 68. So we'll be looking at a lot of events here. Ready? Let me get the old collaboration screen up and running. All right. Shut down a few things. All right. The Cold War, I guess I should define it. Cold War is a bipolar struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from 1945 that's a good question. What year did it end? I'll say 91. Others will say 89, but I think 91. There is no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union during this war. A lot of this is going to be a war by proxy. And so, for instance, the United States in Vietnam will be fighting the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, who are supplied by the Soviet Union and the Chinese. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union will not be fighting the United States. They will be fighting the Afghani people who are being supplied by the United States. So again, this is largely going to be a proxy war. And a lot of it's going to be fought in the Third World, something we'll look at a couple of lectures from now when we shift over to Cold War operations in the 1950s. The origins of the Cold War go back to February of 1945 at Yalta. Yalta was the last wartime conference between FDR, who would die a little over a month after Yalta, Churchill, who would be voted out of office not that long after World War II ended, and of course Stalin, who would go on to continue to rule the Soviet Union for 8 more years. But it is the last meeting of these three at the wartime conference. Yalta itself is in the Soviet Union. It's along the Black Sea. So Roosevelt going a long way for this final conference. And it's the decisions that are made at Yalta that are going to lay the groundwork for the beginning of the Cold War. One of the important decisions, is what is to be done with Germany once the war was over. And Germany is going to be demilitarized and denazified. They're going to break the Nazi Party's hold over these people. And this will be done literally by taking Germans to the concentration camps and showing them what the Nazis did. And if you live too far to go to a concentration camp, you'll be going to a movie theater and watching film footage that was shot in the concentration camps as they were liberated. Some of that footage being shot by a filmmaker named George Stevens, who would later direct now I have forgotten the name of the movie. Giant is one. And now that I'm thinking about it, I can't get it out of my head. George Stevens. Place in the Sun. Giant, The Diary of Anne Frank, and several other films. And so much of that footage, and much of his footage, would play a role in the war crimes trials at Nuremberg after the war. Anyway, tangent. We're going to show the German people what the Nazis were about. Okay? We are going to show them the death camps, the ovens, the piles of bodies. Okay. This will be done by splitting Germany into 4 occupation zones controlled by Britain, France, for some reason, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And then the city of Berlin itself will also be split into 4 occupation zones for the demilitarization and denazification of the country. Second, Poland. The British, who had gone to war because of Poland, remember that if we go back to 1939, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, had said that if Germany went to war with Poland, the British would have to come to Poland's defense. So Churchill is insistent that Poland be recreated. The problem is who is going to run Poland. And so a decision is made to establish a coalition government made up of communist and non-communist Poles, with have an election as soon as possible. That's also the problem with Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe has been liberated by the Soviet Union, and so those are the troops on the ground in Eastern Europe are communist troops from the Soviet Union. So the best that FDR is able to get is a promise for elections as soon as possible. Again, there are very few American or British troops in Eastern Europe, only handfuls of them, and there's no way that they're going to be able to overpower the Soviet army. And then fourth, Roosevelt wanted a successor to the League of Nations. And so this lays the groundwork for the founding of the United Nations. So these decisions, which again are made at Yalta, are going to, this is where the seeds of the Cold War are planted. Was a Cold War inevitable? That is a good question. I don't know. Whether or not FDR would have been able to have any more success than Truman had with Stalin is unknown. FDR really didn't divulge a lot of his thinking about Eastern Europe and Poland in the last few months of his life. I mean, the man could only work 2 hours a day for the last 4 months of his life. So not a lot of effort being put in to thinking about the post-war period. So what happens? How do these seeds that we've planted sprout? Well, let's move forward to post-war 1945 through 1947. The Soviets began to violate the agreements made on Yalta pretty quickly. And the Soviets did this largely by taking control of Eastern Europe. What the Soviets wanted was a buffer zone between Western Europe and the Soviet Union. Let me go to this next slide. So all of this would be the buffer zone. Okay, all of the old actual Soviet Union running through the Baltic states and then through Belarus, the Ukraine, and then these satellites starting in Bulgaria, running up through Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, and then some other allied sites, Yugoslavia and Albania. But all of this is meant to be a buffer zone between Western Europe, which is over here, and the Soviet Union. And so Stalin is obsessed with creating security for the Soviet Union. And the best way to create that security is to put in this buffer zone between his nation and the rest of Western Europe. So as far as the elections go in Eastern Europe, those are pretty much rigged for the Soviets. You know, when your candidate wins 95% of the vote, I'm going to go ahead and say that probably wasn't a pretty fair election. There's also a number of anti-communist candidates for political office who die under mysterious circumstances. They're hit by cars. They fall off rooftops. I think one of them fell on a knife several times. So that kind of stuff. So these are clearly not free and fair elections. They're rigged throughout Eastern Europe. They're rigged in Poland. And again, that is all done to create that buffer zone. In addition to that, though, there were several other crises that sort of gave the impression that communism was replacing the Germans as the next great threat to the world. For instance, and I'll just log these under communist threats. A civil war in Greece broke out between communists and non-communists. A civil war in China, which actually predates World War II, also between communists and non-communists. We already talked about what's going on in Eastern Europe and in Poland with the elections. The Soviets were getting very close to Iran, an important source of oil. And then finally, I'll go ahead and put the rigged elections on here. And then finally, the Soviets in direct violation of agreements made at Yalta, were taking reparations from their zones of Germany. Everyone had pretty much come to the conclusion that the reparations after World War I had been a bad idea. And so everyone had agreed, at least on paper, not to seek out any more reparations. And the Soviets pretty much violated that. The Soviets were literally taking buildings down brick by brick, shipping them back to the Soviet Union, and then rebuilding them exactly as they had looked in Germany. So this is a lot of stuff going on from 1945 through 1947. Again, the assumption was that we thought the Soviets were on our side, so what the flippity-do just happened here? And this is where the Truman administration is kind of lost. They don't understand why the Soviets are behaving this way, and they don't understand how they can stop the Soviets from moving any further. And that is where George Kennan comes in. George Kennan was an American diplomat who had been stationed in the Soviet Union during the 30s and 40s. And in 1947, he had written what was called the Long Telegram. This was an 8,000-word telegram that he had sent from Moscow back to the State Department in Washington, D.C. And then he later collected and expanded on this into an article that was published in Foreign Affairs. The article was called The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Is its official name. Everyone calls it the X article because it was written by Mr. X. Kennan could not put his name to it because he was still working as a field diplomat, but it was a pretty well-known secret in Washington, D.C. who had written the article. But in the article, which, if this were a long semester, you would be reading, but in the article, George Kennan analyzes Soviet behavior, why the Soviets are behaving the way they are, their roots in history, the roots of their paranoia, and he comes up with a solution that he calls containment. That the United States must stop Soviet aggressive tendencies towards expansion. That if the Soviets are trying to move into a new area, then it's the job of the United States to stop them. And if that includes military, that's what we're going to use. If that includes using a bunch of money to try to fix the economy of whatever area the Soviets are moving into, we'll do that as well. And so containment will become the watchword for how the U.S. is going to view the Cold War. That is our job to contain the expansionist tendencies of the Soviet Union. And that means that's going to lead us to Korea, where we're going to contain North Korea's expansionist program into South Korea. It will lead us to Vietnam. It will lead us into all sorts of fun places in the third world. that we'll look at through the rest of the semester. But it's a very influential document published in 1947. And so by 1947, three assumptions about the Soviet Union have formed. Assumption number one is that the Soviets want to dominate the world. Assumption number two is that the Soviets call the shots for all communist movements in the world. So the communist movement in China, the communist movement in Greece, the communist movement in North Korea, the Soviets are calling the shots. We now know in retrospect that's not true. Okay, the Chinese in particular were already peeling off in their own direction. But at the time, we didn't know that. Okay. And then third, what's called the domino theory. If communism took root in one nation, it would threaten its neighbors. So think of this as dominoes falling over. Okay? You've all seen dominoes stack up and they fall over. So if one nation falls, you know, if Germany falls to communism, well, Germany's next to Belgium, so Belgium will fall to communism, then France will fall to communism, and then Spain will fall to communism, and then Portugal, and that's the domino theory. So that's why we wind up in places like Vietnam, because if Vietnam falls to communism, then Cambodia, and then Laos, and then Thailand, and then India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Because of this belief, the entire world is now important to U.S. national security. And so that's going to lead us to some fun places in various parts of the world where, without the domino theory, the U.S. really wouldn't have cared who or what was going on anywhere. So this all kind of comes together in 1947. We have these ideas, all right, but programs to spend the money start to come into place also in 1947. The first one was something called the Truman Doctrine. Policy of the United States, and I'm paraphrasing here, to stop communist movements anywhere in the world. This was initially centered on Greece and Turkey, where communist movements were making serious headway in both of those countries. And eventually, the United States will give help to both Greece and to Turkey under the Truman Doctrine to help defeat the communist movements there. Next up, what was called the Marshall Plan. The background to this is that Europe was having a really hard time recovering from World War II. I mean, look at the place. Move that up a bit. Much of Germany remained, well, like this, sort of this bombed out hellhole. So industrial production was not recovering. Food production was not recovering either. Winter of 1947 was the coldest winter since 1897. And so there was a lot of discontent in Europe. There was a lot of resentment in Europe. And it's under those kind of conditions of hunger and poverty that communist parties in France and Italy were beginning to see increases in their membership. And again, because of the domino theory, if France goes communist, well, that's going to be a threat to Germany and Britain and Spain and Portugal and probably North Africa. So the Marshall Plan was a plan to rebuild Western Europe. Basically, starting in 1948, the U.S. is going to eventually pump $17 billion in loans and grants into rebuilding Western Europe, which again was wrecked by World War II. A lot of that money is going to be spent by Western Europe buying stuff from the United States. So it's also a way to keep our economy humming along in this rebuilding of Western Europe. The Eastern European nations were invited to participate in the Marshall Plan. Stalin's reaction was to simply crack down even further. There are more rigged elections in Hungary. There is an outright invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Soviets simply roll their tanks into Czechoslovakia. They're not even pretending with a phony election. And Stalin also realizes it's time to do something about West Berlin. And this is going to lead to the Berlin crisis. Now, this map shows you the 4 zones of Germany. Okay? The Soviet zone, the British zone, the French zone, and then the American zone. And if you look closely, right here in the Soviet zone, you will see the way Berlin has been divided. There's a Soviet zone of Berlin, then there's a French zone, a British zone, and an American zone. Here's a close-up of it. Okay, this is just the city of Berlin. Okay. So Stalin decided it was time for the rest of Berlin, the part controlled by the US, the French, and the British, it was time for that portion of Berlin to fall under Soviet domination. And so what Stalin did was to close off, this is what I'm talking about here. We're moving into what is called the Berlin Crisis, 1948. Soviet Union closed off all traffic between West Germany and West Berlin. Okay. So again, I'm going to go back to the big map of Germany. There would have been roads and railroads running from Western Germany into Western Berlin. And that it would continue throughout the Cold War. The only way, unless you flew in to West Berlin, you had to drive the one road that was open or the one railroad that was open. So Stalin closes down all the traffic, hoping that he can starve out the rest of Berlin. And eventually the rest of Berlin will hopefully fall into Stalin's hands. There's about 2 million people in Western Berlin, these 3 zones. So Truman does two things to deal with the situation. One, are the Berlin airdrops, where the U.S. Air Force is going to drop supplies into West Berlin every day. We're talking 1,300 tons of supplies every day. That's 26,000 pounds. How many days? 324 days in a row, for a total of 277,000 flights. So we can see this picture, loading up milk, dropping supplies. This also helped bring Germans over to the side of the Americans in particular. As you can imagine, the relationship between the Germans and the people who conquered the Germans was not a particularly easy one. The German people were very suspicious and very resentful, but with the United States now coming in and feeding the entire population, 2 million Germans every day, plus we're bringing medicine, clothing, coal, things like that, it won us a lot of bonus points from the German people. Now that's the first thing Truman does, is put in these airdrops. The second thing Truman does is transfer the B-24 bomber to a U.S. air base in Britain. Now, what the heck is this all about? Well, the B-24 bomber carries the atomic bomb. And from its base in Britain, it can reach the Soviet Union. So this is a message to Stalin, because remember, the Soviets, Stalin, they don't have an atomic bomb. The United States has the only atomic weapons. So this is a little message to Stalin that he better cool it. All right, Harry Truman's already dropped 2 atomic bombs. All right, I don't think he is going to hesitate dropping another if that's what it takes. And that eventually works. This should be the B-29 bomber. That eventually works, and Stalin gives in. Okay. Around May of 1949, Stalin finally gives in and reopens the transportation between West Berlin and West Germany. This whole situation kind of freaked out Britain and France and some of the other countries. You know, again, the United States doesn't have the Soviet Union living right next door. So in order to put our allies at ease, the United States agrees to the creation of NATO in 1947, a collective security pact between the U.S. and Western Europe. And again, collective security, if you attack one member, you attack all the members. Okay. And that's 1949. for NATO. The Soviets responded by forming their own organization called the Warsaw Pact between themselves and their Eastern European nations. There's also the creation or the passage of what is called the National Security Act in 1947. This did three things. It reorganized the War Department into what was called the Department of Defense. It created the CIA. The United States still had no intelligence gathering operations, and so it created the CIA. And then finally, it created what was called the National Security Council. And that advises the president on matters of national security. So basically, every day the president gets a briefing from the National Security Council about threats to the nation. And then the Security Council is usually the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and then the Armed Forces Secretaries. And the president will often discuss security, defense with them before making decisions. One thing the National Security Council does is create reports. There are a lot of reports created by the National Security Council. And one of the reports, probably the most famous one it created, was NSC 68 that was created in 1950, which you can find on the internet now. It was accidentally declassified in the early 1970s. I think I have a copy sitting on my coffee table right now that I've been slowly reading. NSC 68 provides a blueprint for the Cold War based on what's happened between 1945 and 1950. All right. Now, a couple of things have happened in 1949 that we haven't covered yet, but I'll go ahead and tell them to you. Yeah, well, I'll tell you about them now. China was lost to the communists in 1949, and the Soviets exploded their own bomb in 1949. And we're going to come back and look at these later on. So when we talk about 1945, 1950, we have to include those two. NSC 68 makes two assumptions. One, there is now a bipolar struggle between the U.S. and the Soviets. Two, Soviets seek to dominate the world. And then it makes 5 recommendations. Okay. One is to develop the hydrogen bomb. Since the Soviets now have the atomic bomb, we need a bigger and better bomb, and that will be the hydrogen bomb. And then, of course, we'll continue to develop more and more powerful nuclear weapons beyond this. Second, is to build up our conventional armed forces. After World War II, the United States Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force had somewhat shrunk back down, but now it's recommended that we rebuild them, not as big as they were during World War II, but certainly bigger than they are now. 3, increase taxes to pay for all this stuff. 4, increase collective security with more nations. And 5, propagandize the American people to go along with this. So those are the 5 recommendations made by NSC 68, based on, again, the previous 5 years. Speaking of propaganda, here are some. So again, all of those 5 things are recommendations. And this again provides the blueprint of how the Cold War is going to be fought up until about the late 1960s. And then we'll get into something called détente, and then we'll have something after that called rollback, and those are stories we'll get to eventually. Okay, so that's the origins of the Cold War. And to be honest, Congress was really not terribly gung-ho about NSC 68's recommendations, especially the part about increasing taxes and the part about using propaganda against American people. But then North Korea attacked South Korea, and that changed the entire ballgame as far as NSC 68 was concerned. And we will look at Korea in our next lecture. All right, as always, if you have questions, get in touch with me, and I will see you for the Korean War in our next lecture. All right.